DeVante Parker pulled a Frank Gore and left the Eagles before he even played for them. We're going to get into who's going to be wide receiver 3 in 2024 coming up next.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Welcome in, Eagles fans, to a Monday edition of the show. It's brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 back in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. I'm Louis DiBiase, riding solo for the day. Gino will be back tomorrow. 5 days a week. We still got you covered Monday through Friday, even during the dead zone of the offseason when there's not a lot going on in NFL news and Eagles news, but there was some today that actually broke just an hour ago. The Eagles already had a big question mark at wide receiver 3 this year. In the offseason, they tried to stop the bleeding there. Not really the bleeding, because it's not really a desperate situation, a huge need when you have DeVonte Smith, A.J. Brown, Dallas Goedert, Saquon Barkley. Jalen Hurts is a runner. Like, they're going to be fine when it comes to weapons on offense in 2024. This is the best group of weapons in Eagles history on paper, in my opinion, from a talent perspective. Upside, proven ability, age. Like, this is better than 2022, 2010, 2017. You name it. Like, this is the offense. However, wide receiver 3 was a huge question mark with Quez Watkins leaving, and he wasn't anything to write home about the last 2 years, and OZ really wasn't last year either. So they bring in DeVante Parker, Parris Campbell. They draft Ainias Smith in the day 3 range of the draft, as well as Johnny Wilson. So they have 4 guys that were going to battle in camp, but a lot of question marks there. Well, the question marks continue because one of those guys, and one of the only proven players for a certain floor of ability at the NFL level, DeVante Parker, he retired today, according to Adam Schefter. Parker has dealt with a lot of injuries throughout his career, a former first-round pick in 2015. Wants to spend time with his family. It's hard to blame the guy for sure. He's been through a lot in his career and wasn't really guaranteed much of anything with the Eagles. He wasn't guaranteed a roster spot. His contract had little to no guarantees from guaranteed money. So DeVante Parker overall, even if he made the roster, would be a rotational player because they like Parris Campbell. I think they like Smith and Wilson as rookies. Maybe they'll bring in more talent. Parker calls it. This does put the Eagles in a little bit of a predicament, though, because one thing Parker had that Smith really doesn't, that Parris Campbell doesn't, Johnny Wilson maybe does, but he's such a raw prospect, is the ability to play on the outside, to play the X, to play the Z if DeVonte Smith were to get injured like he did at the end of last year. If A.J. Brown got injured, DeVante Parker's one guy you know at least can play on the outside. He has that ability. He has that kind of frame. Now, without him, yeah, I didn't even project him to make the 53-man roster when I did my predictions 2 weeks ago. I think in the slot, Parris Campbell's a better option. They like that speed threat anyway. And Nick Sirianni's a big fan of Parris Campbell since his Indianapolis Colts days. Ainias Smith is going to be someone I think can be used in a gadget role inside in Kellen Moore's pre-snap motion offense. Johnny Wilson is 6'7" and has more upside to be that big-bodied contested catch guy that DeVante Parker presented on this roster. So overall, it's not like the worst thing in the world that Parker is gone. The other 3 I liked better anyway. He was my 4th favorite option here, but it was nice to have a veteran with some sort of production, proven production, and he was a guy that could probably play a big slot role and on the outside if there's injuries. So I think, again, they like Smith, Wilson, Campbell. They're all going to get opportunities to be that wide receiver 3 that plays the majority of the snaps in the slot, that will get the 4th most targets, I would say, or 5th maybe, behind Goedert and Saquon. So those guys are going to get an opportunity. But I think Howie Roseman will, because of the, again, injury perspective, I think he will look outside of his own roster right now to try to replace Parker. And again, I really like Smith and Wilson. I think between the 2 rookies, one will be pretty productive. And Parris Campbell had his best season in Indy with Nick Sirianni. So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Parris Campbell that year he had over 600 yards. Was that 2020? It might have actually been post Sirianni, but I digress. Parris Campbell, somebody that I think if healthy can be an upgrade over Quez Watkins. But you look at the free agent pool right now, there's some guys out there that might already be an immediate upgrade right away over the three guys you have. That doesn't mean they're going to have more upside, but a Hunter Renfrow is still a free agent who the Las Vegas Raiders released. Like, you want a true slot technician, Hunter Renfrow can be that guy. This is somebody that has a season DeVante Parker could never have or never did. Hunter Renfrow 3 years ago had over 100 receptions and over 1,000 yards on a playoff Raiders team. Like, he was Derek Carr's go-to guy. That would make a lot of sense. Mecole Hardman is still out there. He's got that speed in the slot that the Eagles like, another second-round pick from 2019 that the Eagles could have taken if he fell. They really liked Parris Campbell in that draft. I bet if Andy Reid didn't trade up, they would have been interested in Mecole Hardman as well. They wanted Quez Watkins to be that burner next to Smith and Brown. I think they like that compliment of a chunk yardage guy that's not going to get a lot of volume in targets to be that third player. So maybe Mecole Hardman's that guy, somebody that just caught the game-winning touchdown in the Super Bowl a few months ago. Michael Thomas is out there too, another slot veteran player that has more production than DeVante Parker or any of these guys available, although there's a ton of injury risk with him too, like there was with Parker. So there's actually some pretty solid names out there, though, if you want to add another camp body, that fourth man in this wide receiver 3 competition. But again, that can solve the issue of just who's going to be that third target at receiver, regardless of where they play, in the slot, at the Z, at the X. But the guys I mentioned, Renfrow, Hardman, Thomas, they're not outside receivers. So if you're trying to make a move that also solves kind of what Parker did, if Brown or Smith go down, who's an outside receiver for you? I don't know if that guy's really in free agency. Most of these guys are slots. I really wish this news could have broke last week, because the Buffalo Bills went out there and signed Marquez Valdes-Scantling, who has some bad Nelson Aguilar-like drop issues. My bad, Nelly. That was a stray bullet that you didn't deserve. Nelly's my guy. But sounded like a Twitter troll there for sure. Nelson Aguilar's my dude. MVS, though, was a playoff performer over the last 2 years with Patrick Mahomes and the back-to-back Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs. And he's a deep threat, too, that I think can play on the outside a lot more than a Renfrow, than a Hardman, than a Michael Thomas, than an Ainias Smith or a Parris Campbell. Like, the only option the Eagles really have right now outside of a trade, and we'll get into that in segment 2, some trade ideas that I came up with. The only option they have on the outside right now, if Smith or Brown goes down, because you can even mention Britton Covey as somebody that could produce more at receiver this year, who has just been primarily a punt returner over 2 years in Philly. Britton Covey's a slot guy too. So outside of a trade, Johnny Wilson, who you guys know is a my guy for me, but he's raw. He's got a long way to go. He's like your number one guy on the outside. Again, on the outside, not from a target perspective or overall talent. But Johnny Wilson's that only other player right now. Like, instead of thinking about, Joseph Nada or another camp name, like, Wilson's the only bigger name that could maybe fill that X role for you. And that's something that you're getting into 2019 territory or 2020 where you're asking like a Travis Fulgham type to carry the load. And that's, I don't know if it's realistic for Johnny Wilson year one. Maybe it is. I hope it is. I'm not saying that Howie's going to go out and make a move at receiver like right away, like in May, in June. I think he wants to see how Ainias Smith and Johnny Wilson look in camp. I think he wants to see how Parris Campbell looks in camp and some of the other guys that he's brought in. But if nobody's really stealing the show, if Johnny Wilson's not taking that next step and he wants to bring in an outside type of receiver for the depth chart, even if those guys are shining, I think you'll see that more in July, maybe in August, maybe more, training camp time when roster cuts are coming up and other teams are looking to unload some talent they already have that might not make the roster. And maybe that's when Trader Howie comes in. Again, there's some good free agent options for just wide receiver 3, who gets the third most targets at this position. Hunter Renfrow is a great name to consider in that way. I think so too is Mecole Hardman. Jakeem Grant is also a free agent right now from the Miami Dolphins. Those are some good guys that are available May 20th. Like, that's not bad. And I think Renfro's a better, more reliable player right now than DeVante Parker would be. But when it comes to the outside, the only way you fill that void of that primary backup at the X, I think is going to be through a trade. I did come up with some ideas for a wide receiver trade that Howie could make soon. Coming up next, we'll get into that right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and the NHL. FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 back in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 back to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. I hit big the other day with the Minnesota Timberwolves winning Game 7, getting to the conference finals. I am not a Denver Nuggets guy. I know Gino lives in Denver. My brother's a diehard Nuggets fan. I was rooting hard against Nikola Jokic. I'm a big Anthony Edwards guy. He got to the conference finals. I bet the over on his points for. I bet the money line for Minnesota through FanDuel. I won big. You can too. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Again, make every playoff shot count with FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Guys, you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Got to turn down the volume with all the shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel. Program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. DeVante Parker announces that he is retiring from the NFL after 9 seasons, a first-round pick in 2015 from the Miami Dolphins. Overall, not a great career, pretty disappointing. He suffered a lot of injuries, although he destroyed the Eagles back in 2019. The Eagles signed him in March, hoping that he could be, maybe if he stays healthy, a primary boundary backup on the outside behind A.J. Brown and DeVonte Smith. They've tinkered with the idea, I should say, of a bigger slot over the last few years with Julio Jones last year, bringing in DeVonte this year. They're going to need to add another body here for sure, even if they like what Ainias Smith does in the slot or Parris Campbell, even if Johnny Wilson shows that he's farther along than maybe we think on the outside or as a big slot, and he can make this roster and get some snaps if there is an injury. Even if that's the case, you need to add in another receiver that can play on the outside. It can't only be Johnny Wilson. So you got to do that. I'm not panicking, though. They have A.J. Brown. They have DeVonte Smith. They have Dallas Goedert, who really now, even more so, is going to have to stay healthy. Like, they really need Dallas Goedert to stay healthy, so it's not all on Brown and Smith's shoulders this year to pretty much carry the passing production. They're also going to need Saquon Barkley to be much more in the receiving game than DeAndre Swift was last year and Miles Sanders. I think he will be. He's, to me, outside of McCaffrey, the most talented receiving running back in football. Kellen Moore, I think, will get a lot more out of him in that way than Brian Johnson would have with Saquon, or like he did not with DeAndre Swift. So they definitely got to add somebody. They need Goddard and Saquon to step up in the passing game. Smith and Brown need to stay healthy, but DeVante Parker was someone that I didn't even know if he was going to make the roster, if they wanted to keep Covey as that primary returner, if the rookies took steps this year in the summer, Wilson and Smith. But, they didn't offer him almost any guaranteed money in the contract. But again, nonetheless, they're going to have to add somebody on the boundary. That's not going to come from free agency. As I mentioned, you got guys like Hunter Renfrow out there, Mecole Hardman, Michael Thomas. Those guys are all primarily slot receivers. I would say if you're going to get an outside guy, it would probably have to come through a trade. Some ideas that I had, even the trade ideas, it's kind of tough to find an outside guy. I thought of the Tennessee Titans. This is like a buy low kind of move on a guy that was a former first-round pick that has not really done much of anything over 2 years. Somebody from the Tennessee Titans that the Eagles are familiar with because the Titans took him in the A.J. Brown trade. They traded a first-round pick. The Philadelphia Eagles did to the Titans for A.J. Brown. The Titans said, we're going to take Treylon Burks from Arkansas to replace A.J. Brown and hope that he's our version of Justin Jefferson when we trade Stephon Diggs to Buffalo. That hasn't been the case. It'd be really funny, actually, and a big-time troll job by Howie to troll the Titans by having Treylon Burks be A.J. Brown's backup. But it could make a lot of sense. Like, Treylon is a more physical, bigger-bodied slot or outside receiver, and I think that could work. And you probably wouldn't have to pay much, considering they have DeAndre Hopkins. They went out there and paid Calvin Ridley. They went out there and signed Tyler Boyd. I think Treylon Burks could be had for a conditional date. Another name that I thought of that's a better player than Treylon Burks, a former second-round pick from the Indianapolis Colts, that might be on the outside looking in when it comes to a starting job. I don't know if the Colts would want to get rid of him. I think they do value this guy still, but Alec Pierce is is a name to consider. Another physical, bigger DeVante Parker style receiver on the outside that has been a starter for the Colts over the last few years, but they re-signed Michael Pittman. They took A.D. Mitchell in the second round, and I think A.D. Mitchell was a steal that late. I thought he should have been a first-round pick, in my opinion, even with the concerns about his work ethic. Like, he's so talented. And then they have Josh Downs in the slot, who had, over 800 yards receiving last year? So Alec Pierce is someone now that suddenly is wide receiver 4 in Indy, and I think it would be a weird fit in Philly with Brown and Smith healthy, because do you want Alec Pierce in the slot? Although you could move DeVonte Smith inside a lot of the time like you already do, same with A.J. Brown. Like, you could make it work and change those guys around, those three, and make them as a part of a rotation. Slot by committee. You got a big slot guy in Alec Pierce like you would have with DeVante Parker. You've got the run after the catch ability guy in Ainias Smith. You've got the speedster in Parris Campbell. I could see Alec Pierce too. I think he'd cost a lot more than Treylon Burks, but Alec Pierce is somebody that the Colts maybe could look to move if they really like that trio of Pittman, Downs, and A.D. Mitchell. So I thought of Treylon Burks, Alec Pierce. Then there's some more slot options, right? I thought of the Patriots because they have Kendrick Bourne's back on a contract extension. They drafted both Javon Baker and Jalen Polk, who I like both of those rookies a lot. I think they were steals on day 2. Maybe Juju Smith-Schuster, and I know Philly fans aren't going to love that name, but he's a proven player that for the Chiefs 2 years ago was very good for them, and he was a big part of the Eagles losing the Super Bowl. Maybe not big part, but he's on the other end of the James Bradbury penalty. Sorry to bring that back up. Demario Douglas is another speedster with the Patriots. I think they might value too much when it comes to his return ability, but Demario Douglas is another guy, so that's like the 4th and 5th receiver on the New England depth chart. Maybe you can call up the Patriots. I also did think of the Chiefs, because the Kansas City Chiefs have Rashee Rice, although he will be suspended, so maybe they don't want to trade their depth away at receiver. But eventually this year, they will have a trio of Rashee Rice at receiver, Xavier Worthy, and Hollywood Brown. Like, when everybody's healthy, if they are, that's also a big if with the size of Hollywood and Xavier Worthy. But ideally, the Chiefs want it to be Worthy, Brown, and Rice as their top 3 receivers. They have 2 former first and second round picks that they wanted to be starters last year that have not produced, that have been injured or just lackluster on the field. But maybe there's something still left in these guys, and it's a buy low kind of, low risk, high reward move from Howie. And we know Roseman likes to do that, especially with former high draft picks. Maybe Kadarius Toney, maybe Skyy Moore, maybe a Justin Watson. Justin Watson actually last year was like the go-to guy. The Chiefs did not stretch the field almost at all last year. Their vertical game was like non-existent. But I felt like, at least, and I don't know if this is right from a numbers perspective, if it's actually true, but from an eye test perspective, when I would watch the Chiefs last year, I felt like when Mahomes was going deep, it was to Justin Watson. So maybe you could get a Justin Watson, maybe a Skyy Moore, or a Kadarius Toney. I'm trying to think of teams that invested multiple assets, a big contract or a higher draft pick or multiple draft picks into receivers. So now there's a guy on the outside looking in. Kadarius Toney, Skyy Moore, Justin Watson, Treylon Burks, Alec Pierce, Juju Smith-Schuster, Demario Douglas. I think there is I just thought of this guy from the Carolina Panthers, a second-round pick 1 year ago. Would they give up on a second-rounder after a year? Probably not, but what about a Jonathan Mingo? The Panthers traded for Deontay Johnson. They traded up in the draft on day 1 for Xavier Legette, who Gino and I loved from South Carolina. They have Adam Thielen, who was Bryce Young's go-to guy last year. They drafted Jatavion Sanders, who is my second favorite tight end in this class, out of Texas, to be another pass-catching target for Young. Maybe even after 1 year, Jonathan Mingo could be on the block. I don't know. I think there's actually a good amount of names out there. It's not a dire, like, oh my God, DeVante Parker's gone, we have to fix the situation type of situation for the Eagles. Like, I like Ainias Smith. I think between him and Johnny Wilson, at least one's going to be a pretty solid rotational player. And I like the niche roles they have of Wilson's generational size, Smith's dangerous ability to be a run-after-the-catch gadget player that can play in the backfield, that can play in the slot, that can be a returner. I think if Parris Campbell stays healthy, he can be an upgrade over Quez Watkins, even though that's a low bar. I think he could. I think they'll be okay. They have three of the best targets in the NFL in DeVonte Smith, A.J. Brown, Dallas Goedert. I should say four with Saquon Barkley. The sky is not falling, but Howie's going to want to add somebody else at this position. I think there's options in free agency. I think there's options in trades. So I'm really not panicking here with DeVante Parker announcing his retirement. All right, let's have some fun to wrap up the show. Coming up next, we're going to continue our series First Thought. I had another listener nominate two players from the Eagles past that I'm going to throw up on the screen, and I'm going to give you just my first takeaway, the first thought I have of this past Eagle. We'll get into that coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by Game Time with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying NFL tickets. The schedule officially was released last week. I'm already planning my road trips to Philadelphia. I like to go to at least 2 home games a year, but I like to go to at least 1 road game a year too. I'm circling week 3. I'm going to New Orleans against the Saints. I want to go to the Superdome. I love New Orleans. I love NOLA. I've never been to a game, though, at the Superdome. I'm going to go, thanks to Game Time, to the Saints game. I'm also thinking the Cincinnati game on Halloween weekend. I'm also thinking the Cleveland Browns game, Philly versus Cleveland, and then Carolina in December. I like to go to a game against a bad team. That's fun for me because I want an easy win. So I'm doing that all through Game Time, where I can save up to 60% buying last-minute tickets for sports, concerts. I have a lot of concerts I'm going to through Game Time this summer. Comedy, I love stand-up. Theater event, my girlfriend loves a good theater night. We can do that as well through Game Time. Also, I can make sure the seat is great. You get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy your tickets. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use our code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create an account, redeem that code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Louis DiBiase wrapping up this Monday edition of the podcast, talking about who's going to be wide receiver 3. DeVante Parker, one of the main options for that role, is no longer an option, as he's called it a career, retiring from the NFL. That is per Adam Schefter. Broke about an hour and a half ago, actually. So got some news for you, May 20th, to talk about on the show. Now I have a fun game I want to continue to play on the show. We've been doing this at the end of each podcast for the last week. It's called First Thought, where I have either Gino, myself, or a listener from Twitter, or sending me through suggestions to our email, lockedoneaglespodcast@gmail.com, a past Eagle, and I'm going to pull him up on the screen and just the first thought I have about this guy. And I'm going to do that again right now. So for my video viewers, give me a few seconds here. I'm going to pull, I don't know who these players are. I had the listener and then one of our producers edit a graphic for me, and I'm going to pull it up now. So let's see who our first guy is on the day. And it's Michael Vick. So my first thought about Michael Vick, and I hate that this is my first thought, is overhyped in Philadelphia Eagles history. Is that fair? I think that's fair, right? I mean, for me, Michael Vick was my favorite quarterback growing up. You guys know, if you've listened to my show for the last 7 seasons of Locked On Eagles, I love mobile quarterbacks. I adore mobile quarterbacks. It's the most entertaining thing that I like to watch in all of sports, not just in football, but all of sports. And Michael Vick was the ultimate weapon. Like, this was the most explosive quarterback the NFL has ever seen, even over a Randall Cunningham or Frank Tarkenton, Steve Young, Cordell Stewart at the time. There wasn't a lot of these guys. Michael Vick changed the game forever. In 2010, that was maybe the most electric, most difficult quarterback talent to guard maybe the NFL has ever seen. Michael Vick finally took that generational mobility and put it together with his arm. We know he had one of the strongest arms in the league since he got drafted first overall in 2001 by the Atlanta Falcons, but he never had the processing down, the pocket presence, the accuracy, the efficiency as a passer to make his players around him better. But Andy Reid got that out of him in 2010. And as a kid, I was only 13 years old. That was the most fun I had growing up watching football. I have a plaque right above my computer of Michael Vick's historic Monday night game against Washington. Like, I've never had that much fun outside of 2017 watching Eagles football. 2010, Michael Vick, that was my guy. However, and I noticed this the last few weeks with some fun Eagles Twitter topics, like who's the, your typical dead zone offseason topics, like who's the Eagles' greatest quarterback of all time, Mount Rushmore kind of like lists and games. Like that's what we do around this time of year when we want to keep talking Eagles football. And I always see Michael Vick grouped in with Donovan McNabb, with Randall Cunningham, heck, even with Nick Foles and Jalen Hurts and even Carson Wentz. Michael Vick, to me, is overhyped and I think unfairly grouped in as like a historically great Eagle. He had an historically great season. Michael Vick of 2010, there's only 2 quarterbacks that I would say in Eagles history that were that unstoppable. The other 2 like single best quarterback seasons in Eagles history, I'd say, are Carson Wentz in 2017 and Jalen Hurts in 2022. Honorable mentions, you could say Randall Cunningham in 1990, Donovan McNabb in 2004, maybe Nick Foles in 2013. But it's mostly Wentz 2017, Jalen Hurts 2022, Michael Vick 2010. He was one of the greatest players in Eagles history for a single season, and he was an MVP runner-up. And I know he played with the Eagles for 5 years, but the other 4 years were not great. He was actually here for 6 years, right? Because he signed in 2009. But 2009, he was the 3rd string. 2011, the Dream Team year, he wasn't able to stay healthy. Like they ended the year hot, and he played really well in a 4-0 finish to get to 8-8, and they almost made the playoffs, but that wasn't a great year. That was a disappointment. 2012, they won 4 games, and he turned the ball over more than almost any quarterback the first month of the year before being out the majority of the season, and Andy Reid got fired. 2013, he's got a really fun season opener in Chip Kelly's new-look offense, but then after like 4 or 5 games, he got injured again, and then lost his job to Nick Foles. Like, he never won a playoff game. He only played in 1 playoff game for the Eagles. I hate that I'm like trashing on Vick a little bit. I'm not trashing Vick because, again, he was one of my favorite players growing up, but I think he's unfairly grouped in with like Eagles greats. And again, he had an Eagles great season, but I don't think Michael Vick did enough in Philly to be considered like an Eagles legend. And somebody was giving me crap for this topic I was talking about on Twitter the other day and said, well, why do you consider Carson Wentz in that? He never won a playoff game either. He never even played he played in 2 drives of a playoff game in 2019. While that's correct, without Carson Wentz, you don't have your only Super Bowl in franchise history. You can't say the same thing about Michael Vick. Also, Carson Wentz in 4 of 5 seasons in Philadelphia was extremely important and to me was very effective. Even in years where it wasn't 2017, like 2016, he was pretty good and carried a pretty talentless offense as a rookie. 2018, yeah, he got hurt and he wasn't the same as 2017, but had another great touchdown to interception ratio that year and was getting hot at the end of the year. They were 6-6 and then he had that fracture in his back. 2019, he had over 4,000 passing yards without a single receiver surpassing 500 yards on the year. No NFL quarterback has ever done that in NFL history to this day. Carson Wentz had one of the worst seasons in NFL history or in Eagles history in 2020, actually both. But 4 or 5 years for Carson Wentz, you would say were at least okay or were good. Michael Vick, I can really only say that about like 1.5 seasons, like 2010 and then half of 2011. But the start of 2011, Michael Vick wasn't good either, and he got hurt. Week 2 Sunday Night Football, he got hurt. Halfway through the year, he got hurt. That was Michael Vick in Philly. He wasn't available enough, and he was electric. I loved watching him when he was on the field. Some of the best highlights in franchise history come from number 7 in Midnight Green, and hell no, it wasn't Sam Bradford. I hate that he was the next guy to wear that jersey. But for me, Michael Vick, I would say my first thought is a little overhyped in Eagles history. All right, let's get to the next guy here. And it's Darius Slay. Interesting. My first thought about Darius Slay, I'm going to go the opposite approach of what I just said with Michael Vick. I would say underappreciated. Darius Slay, before Darius Slay, the Eagles were in cornerback hell for almost my entire life as an Eagles fan, or at least since Asante Samuel, who left in 2011 after the Dream Team year with Nnamdi Asomugha and DRC there. So the Eagles went from 2012 to 2020. They went 8 years without having a very good corner. They had okay corners. Jalen Mills was okay. Ronald Darby was okay. They didn't have a Darius Slay. Darius Slay has given you cornerback consistency for the first time in over a decade. 2020, he was solid. He was pretty good. 2021, he was an all-pro. He was amazing in 2021. 2022, he was an amazing all-pro. I'll never forget the demons that man exercised for us on Monday Night Football, locking up the best receiver in the league in Justin Jefferson and having 2 interceptions, and he could have had 4 or 5. He strapped the best receiver in the league. Darius Slay, even last year, was solid. He wasn't as good as he was in 2021 or 2022, but he wasn't James Bradbury either. I don't think he gets appreciated enough. I don't think he gets talked about enough since he joined the team in 2020. Maybe because he's just been that good and that consistent that we don't have to worry about him. Like, not hearing from a corner is a good thing, and we just always assume he's going to hold one end of the field and he can shadow a CeeDee Lamb or Justin Jefferson if we need. So I think maybe that's a little bit of this conversation, but also he's gotten a lot of crap on Twitter over the last year and a half because of his podcast, and some people have called him selfish. Even I got on him a little bit last year for having that surgery at the time of when he did that. But overall, like, a lot of players, a lot of athletes now that have podcasts are kind of getting crap from fans and media because they're a lot more honest. They show their personality, and Darius Slay talks about his individual performance, and sometimes in a loss or in a bad defensive performance, fans don't like that. But Slay's authentic to himself, and I think he's a great leader for this football team. He's a captain, and he could have left for probably more money last year. He could have went to Baltimore or another team, and Philadelphia basically said, like, we'll only bring you back on a certain contract, and he came back. And I think he's going to be really important to this team this year to help develop Quinyon Mitchell, like Jason Kelsey did for Cam Jurgens, like Jason Peters did for Jordan Mailata. That's really important. I think Darius Slay is going to be really good still this year, too. I think he's going to be a solid corner for you on the field, but there's so many young corners that I think are going to benefit from having Slay on this team, including Quinyon Mitchell, Cooper DeJean, Keely Ringo, Isaiah Rodgers, Eli Ricks. Like, it's a young group. Josh Jobe, Zach McPherson. Slay is very important to this team, both on and off the field. And he's been the best corner you've had in over a decade, more than a decade, since 2011. It's been 13 years. And I think Darius Slay has been that guy. And I don't think it gets talked about enough. So, and this week I wanted to say that even more because he's been getting, I don't know what the context of the situation is, but I saw him going back and forth with more Eagles fans again on Twitter this week. So Darius Slay, put some respect on his name for sure. I think he'll be CB1 again or maybe CB1A or 1B with Quinyon Mitchell in 2024. All right, Eagles fans, that's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. Thanks so much for making us your first listen each and every day. We'll be back tomorrow, and we'll be Tuesday through Friday as we still remain your only daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much for downloading, watching, and listening, and let's go Birds. Fly, Eagles, fly.